Cool. So I'm Dan. Right now I'm a product manager at a robotics company. I used to work at Facebook. Before that, I was at Tencent in China. I used to write a lot about Chinese tech. But today I'm going to talk about simulation games. Before we do that, I want to go back to 2020. So that was kind of a crazy year for me. I was still working at Facebook then. It was, it's a terrible year, right? And I remember this day was sort of my nadir. Was for folks who don't live in the Bay Area. We had this day where we have wildfires every year in California, but we had one where they're pretty close to San Francisco, and the sky was orange the whole day. And I remember there's so much going on. There's the elections were ramping up. Apparently, the postal service was being dismantled. Had stuff going on at work, and then to top it all off, why is the sky orange at 3 in the afternoon? Like, the world is literally burning. So it was a pretty dark year, I think, for a lot of folks, and we kind of coped with it in different ways. I found myself during the pandemic, first started watching a lot of movies, so there's nothing to do. But at one point, I got into video games, which was something that I had sort of not done a lot of since I had gone to college and started working. But I had all this stuff on Steam, and I had all this time to go through it. And I got into simulation games, something I hadn't done since high school. And there's a lot of them. There's all sorts of crazy things that people are making now. I got sucked into this one it's called Workers and Resources, Soviet Republic. It's this studio in Slovakia that makes this game. And the way this game works is, in SimCity, if you wanted to build a coal power, you're running out of power, you want to build another power plant, you just click and you say, okay, power plant number 2 is built. In this game, you have to think about, well, where's all the stuff that is going to go in the power plant? Where do the bricks come from? Where does the asphalt come from? And how are the workers getting to the construction site where the coal power plant is being built? And where do they get their food? And where's the coal coming from? Is there a mine somewhere? Are we importing that? If we're importing it, what's the balance of trade? So you can tell by my description, this is not fun. This is exhausting. My wife saw me playing. She's like, I don't get this. How is this fun? You're right. It's not that fun, but it's very compelling. Some of these games. So this is what I talk about. Is why are these compelling and why are these relevant? And why are there so many of these now? What is it about sim games? So that's sort of that's the point of this talk. So how do they speak to the world, and what is it on an emotional level that's interesting about these? But let's start with a little history first. The first one I think a lot of people would point to, or sort of the history of the genre, the genesis of the genre, was there's this game, I think it was a Commodore game or a Amiga game or something that Will Wright, the guy who had made SimCity, one of the first games he made was this air raid game where you're like a World War II bomber pilot and you're bombing these industrial sites and they keep building back and you have to target the right industries. And he got so engrossed in making that aspect, not the bombing part, but the simulated cities part, that you can see how that kind of turns into what we later know as SimCity. And it turns out the way that happened was Will Wright talked to his neighbor and he was telling him about these little cities in this game he was making. And his neighbor was an architect and told him to look into this guy, Jay Forrester, who is a professor at MIT, who invented the field of system dynamics. And he had this book called Urban Dynamics, which ended up being kind of a controversial book. But he kind of maps out here's how cities work, and he reduces it down to something like 150 equations and 200 variables. He was kind of a right wing sort of libertarian kind of guy. There's a lot of things in the model that maybe we wouldn't think of as very correct today. But it ended up, getting a lot of things right. and a lot of things, had a lot of surprising things about it. So Will Wright talks about how, in the first versions of SimCity, you could notice these kinds of phenomena, how, when you build more roads in your city, you actually get more traffic because more people, it's more attractive to drive now. And these are things you realize just by playing the game. And they didn't have to program that in. It kind of emerged in the way it does in real cities. And if you go on to Nextdoor or Facebook, you can see people still don't quite understand this idea. This is not a widely understood thing. Here's a guy in San Jose. He's saying, well, why are we building more skyscrapers when the freeways are already crowded? Well, it turns out if you put people closer together, you don't need as much freeway to get between buildings and can ride on trains and stuff like that, right? There's a guy asking, I think probably somewhere in the South Bay, he's asking, well, why do we have so many bike lanes? Nobody's on bikes. What's the point of these bike lanes? Well, it turns out if you build more bike lanes, a lot more people will ride bikes, right? Or at least that's the theory. And of course, we see stuff like this all the time in the pandemic and in real life. I got into riding a bike during the pandemic, and it turned out everybody had the same idea at the same time, right? So there's nothing to do, nothing was open. And turned out we don't actually make bikes in the U.S. So they're all tied up in factories abroad or in containers somewhere. And we saw something during the pandemic. It was called the bullwhip effect, which is actually coined by Jay Forrester, which is this phenomenon where and I think at least with gas, like there's a lower demand for gas for a while, and so you had less, the refineries shut down at some point, and then at some point you have to start them back up, and you have these sort of complex shocks that are rippling through the supply chain in this very counterintuitive way. So this stuff is around us all the time. Like we're always dealing with interconnected systems, but that isn't really the way people see the world, is it? People sort of see it as there's sort of good guys and bad guys. We had these stickers during the pandemic where, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's Biden's fault. He said, yeah, I want the gas prices to be high. That's how it happened, right? Like this is what people think. And then of course Biden said, oh no, it's not supply chain, it's greed, right? Right. The companies weren't greedy before, now they're greedy. It's a moral failing. That's why the gas prices are high, right? So we see this all the time. And I think one thesis here is, if people had more experience with these kinds of games, if this was a type of entertainment that more people consumed, I think you start to disabuse yourself of that notion. You start to think about what are the systems and what are the different feedback loops and tipping points and why is the world the way that it is. So there's another aspect. So this is an interesting quote from Forrester that I like, where he said, there are orderly processes at work in the creation of human judgment and intuition that frequently lead people to wrong decisions when faced with complex and highly interacting systems. The mental model is fuzzy, is incomplete, is imprecisely stated. And that is in a nutshell what's wrong with discourse right now. Is we're not going back to models and systems and trying to understand how does it all work and where is it breaking down. We're trying to find the good guys and the bad guys and sort of build these narratives that aren't always true, right? So sim games are about systems. Like that is sort of all of them kind of, that ends up being the object is figuring out the system in the game. Another thing is trade-offs. So actually, let me get to another thread on this too. This is sort of what I was talking about too. So I read this book during the pandemic by this guy Bruno Maches, where he kind of spends the whole book just dumping on American politicians, but he has this theory about how American politics is very Hollywood, right? We are always trying to find the narrative. It is sort of this pageant. And I think we get that by he talks about Reagan as kind of the prototype for Trump, and he dumps a lot on AOC and sort of the rolling out of the Green New Deal. He's a lot like Taleb, and I don't think this is uniquely American, but this is kind of what I'm talking about, where our minds are shaped by the kind of media we consume, and seeing things, watching a lot of movies and even playing games where very narrative centered. I think it does change your mind to think in this way. So when the pandemic first started, I remember, kind of getting to the bottom of what was on Netflix, and at one point I watched that movie Outbreak, and because it was kind of one of the ways we were processing the thing. There's a movie Contagion that came out a few years ago. So if you watch Outbreak, your conception of what's going to happen is, probably a lot of things will shut down. Probably at some point, Dustin Hoffman is going to have to escape from somewhere, and he's going to be hanging from a helicopter. But if you've played Plague Inc., you actually come with a couple of useful conclusions about what was going on then. Which is, if you've played this game, you realize you don't start out with Ebola. You start out with something innocuous. You get it to spread. You realize shutting down flights from a couple countries probably isn't going to do much once it's spread, and you realize probably the mutations are really what's going to get you down the line. And a lot of the policy kind of started to make more sense, right? So I think that is one way these games can help us. And even when the models in these games are not exactly accurate and they're kind of kind of exaggerated, they get you to think about systems, and I think that's a good thing. So another aspect is trade-offs. This is another aspect of the real world. So there's a tall story here about, I was reading the memoir of Sid Meier, who's a prolific game designer, made Railroad Tycoon, made Civilization, made a bunch of other stuff. And he talks about the first Railroad Tycoon game. And in designing that game, he made these bridges, and he made it so that your railroad bridges would just wash away because there'd be floods and things all the time. And when people tested that, though, it wasn't that fun. They didn't think, oh, it's so realistic. Oh, it's so clever that you came up with this. It's just kind of a bummer. It just kind of sucks that you're playing this game and your bridge is gone. And he changed a bit. He made it so that you could have these cheap wooden bridges that could wash away, or you could build these expensive stone bridges. And he realized that is kind of the essence of a good game. And in his mind he said good games are a series of interesting decisions. Interesting meaning there isn't a right or wrong. It's trade-offs. And he talks about Civilization too. People would criticize Civilization and about this sort of historical accuracy and like, why isn't there slavery in the game, things like that. And his response to that was, it's not really the point, is to model history exactly. The essential properties trying to capture that game is that leaders have to deal with trade-offs where there isn't always a right or wrong, and it sort of affects the way that you see the world. And I like this quote from him. He says, in the right context, a game is not just a vehicle for fun, but an exercise in self-determination and confidence, which I'll come back to in a sec. Good games teach us there are trade-offs to everything, actions lead to outcomes, and the chance to try again is almost always out there. So I think that's another sort of important property of reality that these games try to capture. And of course, we see this a lot in real life, where I live in Oakland. We had a series of protests, one a bit before the pandemic, one kind of after, where one was, people were in solidarity with the teachers union and advocating for more pay. And then by the end of the pandemic, a lot of people had unenrolled their kids and people were moving out. There's these big migration patterns. And the way the school district had to deal with it was they realized they had way fewer students per school than most other school districts. And it'd be more economical to kind of keep the teachers they had and shut down some of the neighborhood schools, this is also very controversial. So you have one protest where we stand with the teachers are the important thing. And then other people, no, it's the physical school buildings, that's the important thing. And I'm being a bit reductive, but boy, what a tough job that is to be running the Oakland school district. Probably maybe not quite as bad as running the Oakland police, but this is all the time. There's no right answer to any of this stuff. It's life is hard, right? So this is kind of if I were to reduce into a nutshell, any sim game, whether it's SimCity or Factorio or the Soviet Republic one, this is kind of what the foundational worldview that all of these games take place in, which is basically saying systems are what explain the world. It's not narratives. It's not good guys and bad guys. And the outcomes that we all live with every day, whether it's the roads or the schools or the gas prices. It's not about who had a good idea and who was virtuous. It's just all of these complex interacting systems that kind of come together in weird ways that we don't always anticipate. And that is kind of our reality. It's not, and also, like I said about trade-offs, like there's a good quote from Tom Sowell. There are no solutions, only trade-offs, and I think that's a really true quote. So that is kind of the view that they take. I don't think it's always the right view to take of any situation, but it's not one that you get a lot by consuming a lot of the media that we consume, and for that I think they're a good thing. So then I want to address the other question, which is what is it that's compelling about these? Because like I said, these are not fun. There are games that are a lot more fun than sim games, but people are spending all this time making these and playing them. So what is it about them? So I want to talk about one story. So this is the cinematic that comes up when you play. Sid Meier made another railroad game. It's called Railroads. It's sort of a dumbed down railroad tycoon. It has the cinematic where there's a guy with a model railroad and it kind of grows into the whole railroad empire or whatever. The origin of this, I found out by reading his book, was when Sid Meier was a kid, he got sent off to go live with his relatives in Switzerland. He grew up in the US, had some family in Switzerland. And it was kind of a difficult transition at first. But one thing that he really liked about Switzerland as a kid was the trains. Because they have an incredible railway system there. And he would go to the town square every day at the same time, get an ice cream cone and watch the trains. And he got a timetable, and he was just in awe that someone had to figure out how to make all these trains run on time. And it happened every day like clockwork. And this was sort of an enthralling thing to him. And when he went back to the US, he made this model railroad with his father and took over the whole dining room. And this just became a fascination of his for years. And later in the book, he realizes that what was going on at the time in his life was that he had an older sister who had Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he remembered all this. He remembered going to visit her. And he hadn't made the connection that the reason he was being sent away was so that he wouldn't have to deal with his sister's death. And maybe this was sort of a coping thing. He's just got into these things like trains. But I think that's something that people do. Another story is, I was looking at some interviews with Will Wright when I was putting this piece together. And after the first SimCity happened, his house burned down. He wasn't in it at the time, but lost everything. Will Wright lived in the Oakland Hills. So this is a screenshot from a game that came out a couple years after that. This is SimCity 2000, and if you remember, they added the disasters. So you could click and make a tornado, or you could have the space monster come down. But it ships with this scenario that's the Oakland Hills burning, which I can't think is coincidental. But one of the things that he reflects on is that he had to go rebuild his whole life. He had to go to IKEA and figure out, what kind of bed am I going to have, and what do these things really mean to me? And he got on this whole psychology kick, and that's sort of where we get The Sims. You can see there's some inspiration from like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I guess in this scenario, right, they got the hunger meter is fine. It's the room meter. The fire going on in this picture really is not good on the vibe. The whole decor. Right? So I thought that was really interesting that he kind of turned this loss into this sort of intellectual foray into what is happiness. And I think this is kind of what a lot of people bring to when they play The Sims too. It sort of helps them think about these things. So one last story. I was following when I was playing the Soviet Russia game. The Ukraine war was happening earlier this year, and a lot of the fans of this game asked the makers, well, why don't we have armies in Soviet Republic? like, wouldn't that be a really cool thing to add to the game? Because if you've ever played Tropico, there's this kind of neat element where not only are you managing the social and kind of the economic angle of your island, you have military coups and you have the superpowers invading you and stuff. And their reaction to that was like, are you freaking kidding me? Because in Czechoslovakia, the Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia in the late 60s. And it was this horrible period of repression. And they said something to the effect of, if it weren't for the fall of socialism, we wouldn't even be here making this game. And their reaction was, well, the point of this game is we have all this nostalgia for some of the good parts of that era. That's why they have all of the historically accurate Soviet vehicles and things from that time. And we don't want to bring back the bad. Like that would not be the point of making this game. We don't want to have the military. We don't want to have tools of repression in this game, which I thought was a really interesting angle. And they made a DLC where they had a lot of like classic Ukrainian buildings and planes and things like that you could add to the game. So when I thought about this more, I realized a lot of the people who were making these things, who were inspired to make these games, it was kind of coming out of the same sort of dark, vulnerable place, right? And the way that these games were all made, even though, like I do think, having models and teaching people about models is an important thing. They left a lot of things out of these models, right? In the Soviet Republic game, the army doesn't invade you. Your bridges in real life, your bridges wash away, your family dies. There's a lot of horrible things that happen in life. And this is sort of a way of processing it. It's a way of thinking about it. And that was kind of where a lot of these were coming from. But at the same time, they also don't capture a lot of what is good about life, and you can't model everything, right? And that is sort of the other conclusion is that it's probably a point where it's probably good to put these things away, right? Just go live your life. Myself, I ended up so I work in industrial automation now. And I found myself I don't play very many of these games anymore because my whole life is Factorio now, right? But yeah, that's my take on sim games. I'd love to talk about this more with folks.
Cool. So I guess any questions? Raise a hand, drop them in. So I have one for you. I have one for you, Dan. Just in the absence of anyone else asking. So simulation games kind of they situate the player as like the all powerful like controller, right?
Yeah.
And now you've got kind of like there's a kind of an increased access and development of like agent based modeling, like tools and techniques and approaches, right? Like, do you see that changing how sim games are played and made like in the future? Is it still just like the kind of the player as this godlike entity still manipulating the system, but the system just like happens to contain more intelligent agents? Or do you see that dynamic changing as kind of like the agents can have a bit more autonomy themselves within the system?
Well, I think those are kind of two different things. Like in some of the games, like in SimCity, you're purportedly the mayor, but of course you're not. The mayor can't just like build a road and have it appear instantly. And really, it's more you're just kind of this disembodied. You are the city itself, really, as the character in that game. Maybe in Tropico, it's different. You have kind of a personality as the dictator. But I think the defining quality of these is there isn't. You aren't really omnipotent. You are kind of the thing. You are the system, which is kind of a weird aspect of these games. And I don't know if like the agent-based thing changes it that much. Like I think it'll make some of the models more interesting and more accurate. I know that, like the newer SimCity, they tried that.
That's interesting. We have a question from Maya. So I can read out, or Maya, you can voice it.
Okay, so I'll ask a question. The question is, when you play one of these games, what is the scope for creativity? In other words, you have a lot of scope for finding the loopholes in the rules, but the real world, has a lot of detail, and the game kind of hides that detail and teaches you to ignore it. So there's a certain type of creativity that you're taught, not to do.
Yeah.
What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean,
By
I
the
think
way, as compared to a Dungeons and Dragons game, where you can
as
always
compared to what?
query Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
where you can query the dungeon master, and you will get more detail, and creative things can happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a place for all these kinds of things. Yeah, I mean, I saw there's something someone had figured out all the rules of SimCity, and they made this perverse kind of hyper optimized city that looked like no place you'd ever want to live in, right? Um, yeah, I think to a certain extent, it doesn't matter that these things aren't really modeling reality, because the point is to model the essential structure of reality, which is that it is based on the confluence of rules and systems, and there are emergent properties. So I think to a certain extent, you're not gaining much by going and figuring out, reverse engineering the exact rules of these things. It's kind of taking it too far. But I think in terms of all of the media we consume, it's not a bad thing to spend some time with media that reflects this sort of outlook.
I think Venkat's question was on what's your thoughts on blockchain simulation games, such as Dark?
I haven't played it. Are there good blockchain games? Or I kind of looked at blockchain games like
I can comment briefly. I've dabbled in a couple of simple ones, and a lot more action is going on. Saw a bunch at DevCon, but yeah, everybody was super excited about Dark Forest, which is kind of based on the Three Body Problem novels. And the nice thing about games on the blockchain is, even though the fidelity and complexity of the simulation is very low, the worlds can be pretty much open ended. Like you can uh, tack on random things and weird game mechanics that kind of emulate real world openness much better than high fidelity like traditional simulation games. So that's why I was curious. But yeah,
I'll have to check that one out. That sounds cool.
Jenna's got a hand up. So
Hey, Dan, going completely the other direction, about 100 years ago, my parents, knowing that I was interested in the environment, right? This is in the dawn of the modern era, gave me a game one year for my birthday that was called Predator Prey. And you use paper and pens and stuff. Maybe everybody knows about this one, where you're modeling the rise and fall of predator and prey. So as the rabbits grow in population, the wolves also grow, and then the rabbits collapse, and it all repeats again. So I think I was been thinking about Mayor's question, that the thing that you're after is what we often on our Discord call intuition pumping or priming. So tuning up your intuition about how a system works. The risk, of course, then is you're learning the wrong things. So that's what Mayor's kind of getting at. So a well-designed game,
because it's not really a good model of how.
Right.
rabbits
And
work.
it's so hard to know, but in general,
Yeah.
a good game does good intuition priming, is maybe one way of summarizing that.
Yeah, I think that's true. That is a danger. Like, I mean, my take was that maybe it doesn't matter if the model is that good, because it's just you're engaging with a medium where the model is the main character, and I think that's a constructive thing. But you're right, people could come away with some wrong ideas, and I think people have even made that accusation with SimCity, right? In some of these games.
Oh, sure. Actively teaching the wrong intuition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
just on just a final question from me before we take a break. That kind of latched on to what Jenna was saying. Like, how much of the psychological appeal of these games is that? Do you think is that they create a kind of like a moral sandbox that isn't viable in reality, and you can sincerely kind of experiment with the bad side? So personally, I remember like playing a sim game, and there was this trick where like you dig a pool and then like you take the ladder away and then you kind of very,
Yeah.
very perversely just inflict all these sorts of things. Like, how much of a factor is that in the broad appeal, do you think?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Might be revealing a lot about myself.
I guess better in a game than in real life.